Bonsoir. Bienvenue au Jeu de Paume pour cette rencontre exceptionnelle avec Kenneth Goldsmith à l'occasion de la parution de deux ouvrages, Patrimoine Pirate et Street Poet and Other Visionary, tous deux publiés aux éditions JBE Books. Théoricien, artiste, poète et enseignant, Kenneth Goldsmith crée le site UbuWeb en 1996. Il y rassemble des sons, mais aussi des textes et des vidéos issus des avant-gardes occidentales. C'est en développant le concept de non-créativité créative que Goldsmith s'impose comme un acteur important de la poésie contemporaine américaine. Son approche de la textualité numérique a transformé en grande partie le champ des études littéraires, artistiques et médiatiques. En 2013, le Jeu de Paume, dans le cadre de sa programmation satellite, Kenneth Goldsmith participait à la série d'expositions parlées initiée par le commissaire Mathieu Copeland. Kenneth Goldsmith a publié de nombreux ouvrages, entre autres traduits aux éditions JBE Books, L'écriture sans écriture, Against Translation, Poétique, une collaboration avec l'artiste Bernard Venet, et Théorie, une magnifique ramette de poésie. Les ouvrages qui nous réunissent ce soir, tout d'abord Street Poet and Other Visionary, retrace une quarantaine d'années de collecte dans les rues de New York de plusieurs centaines de petites annonces et affiches publicitaires, aussi imprévisibles qu'utiles, qui empruntent les codes de l'art brut, du cubisme et de la poésie concrète. À travers ce recueil, Kenneth Goldsmith interroge les limites de l'art. Le second ouvrage, Patrimoine Pirate, archives, circulation et polémiques artistiques à l'âge numérique, est une traduction de Lionel Ruffel et Stéphane van der Haag, de l'ouvrage Duchamp is my lawyer, paru chez Columbia University Press en 2020. La postface est de Jacopo Rasmi. Patrimoine Pirate démontre les mécanismes de circulation des œuvres et des savoirs numériques et la révolution de notre perception de ceux-ci. À l'heure d'une intelligence artificielle qui absorbe tout, nous sommes aujourd'hui les pirates de tout ce qui nous précède, et Patrimoine Pirate éclaire les craintes et les attentes de ces révolutions en cours. De cet ouvrage, Yves Citon dit « Patrimoine Pirate est à la fois une économie politique alternative de l'accès libre, une introduction humoristique à la poétique juridique, une enquête joyeuse sur la résistance artistique et une boîte à outils permettant de garder le web aussi libre que nous le souhaitons. » Kenneth Goldsmith et Jacopo Rasmi dialogueront avec David Desrimais, directeur des éditions JBE Books. Merci beaucoup David pour cette belle proposition de rencontre et merci à Lisa Valentin de nous avoir aidés à la préparer. En fin de rencontre, nous nous retrouverons à la librairie autour de l'ouvrage et d'un verre. Kenneth Goldsmith ne manquera pas de vous dédicacer votre livre. La rencontre se déroulera en anglais et je vous souhaite une bonne soirée et passe la parole à David.
Merci beaucoup Pascal. Merci au Jeu de Paume pour son accueil et pour votre accueil. C'est absolument réjouissant d'être là, je crois 10 ans après la première venue de Kenneth Goldsmith ici. Je vais être très bref, c'est une micro-introduction après ton introduction. Pour vous dire que, donc, en effet, la rencontre se déroulera en anglais, dans deux types d'anglais. D'abord, Kenneth Goldsmith vous fera une lecture d'une partie du livre, et puis ensuite, on basculera sur un anglais with a strong French accent and also a very strong Italian accent, I may say, avec Jacopo Rasmi et des inclusions en français. L'idée, là, c'est vraiment de se dire qu'on est ensemble pour 1 heure ici et qu'ensuite, on fonce à la librairie pour se retrouver autour d'un verre et de la possibilité de poursuivre la conversation tous ensemble. Pour l'instant, c'est d'abord avec Kenneth Goldsmith que nous allons commencer pour une vingtaine de minutes, suivi d'une discussion d'une autre vingtaine de minutes, suivi d'une discussion ensemble et d'une discussion là-haut. Voilà, merci, passez un bon moment. Je passe la parole à Kenneth et encore merci beaucoup. À tout de suite.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Pascal, and thanks to everybody for being here. It's so good to see so many dear and old friends in the room. So I'm going to just give the beginning of this book of Patrimony. What is it? I called it Duchamp is my lawyer. And it has a new name here, Patrimoine Pirate, which we can really talk about, the sort of misunderstanding of Duchamp in America, or perhaps. This is just a really short, boiled down part of the introduction to the book. There's a back door to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City that few know about. Invisible to the bustling crowds at the main entrance on 53rd Street, it's desolate except for the occasional noisy school group or quiet academic researcher entering and exiting. There are no admission fees or snaking queues, only a lonely intern sitting at the desk. And if you take the elevator to the top floor of this building, you'll find the MoMA Library. And it was there in the late 1970s that a librarian named Clive Philippot created a policy unlike any other in the history of the museum. Without asking permission, he decreed that anybody could mail anything to the MoMA Library and it would be accepted and become part of the official collection. There was no limit to what could be sent, nor were there specifications of size, medium, or provenance. No judgments were made about the quality either. The artist could be world famous or completely unknown. It made no difference. Once something was sent, no questions were asked. Whatever was received was accepted. And Philippot estimates that between 1997 and he estimates that between 1977 and 1994, he got anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 artists in the MoMA collection this way. This is amazing. Isn't that, it's a phenomenal number. And Bob Dylan once said, I had gotten in the door when nobody else was looking, and I was in there now, and there was nothing that anybody from then on could ever do about it. Similarly, Philippot's gesture was so under the radar that the front door, which would be the museum administration, and the curatorial wing paid no attention to it. And once they did, it was too late. Nobody was going to return all those crates and boxes that had piled up over the years, never mind removing hundreds of thousands of artists from the database. And while some of those artifacts from those acquisitions are quite valuable and remain on display in the galleries, most of them languish in MoMA's remote storage facility out in Queens, stacked up in the boxes that they were originally sent in. And they're all still part of MoMA's collection. Now, sometimes the back door was used to get artworks actually into the museum. And Chuck Close was asked to curate an artist choice exhibition. And he decided to choose a selection of portraits from MoMA's collection. And he wanted to include Ray Johnson, the great male artist, who at that time was, unbelievably enough, still not actually in the MoMA collection. So in order to get himself in, Ray Johnson made a Xerox of this funky cartoon about William de Kooning. He stuffed it into an envelope and he mailed it off to Clive Philippot, courtesy of the library. And sure enough, the cartoon was entered into the MoMA collection with the credit line, gift of the artist, the Museum of Modern Art Library, special collections, therefore able to be included in Close's show. And the back door then is this powerful tool. While all eyes are elsewhere, magical things can happen in the margins. Andy Warhol once said that if you want to collect something in New York, you have to find out what it is that nobody else wants and collect that. And before long, everyone will want it. And he was right. Once he began collecting ugly ceramic cookie jars, everybody started collecting them. And by the time he died, his cookie jar collection, which he paid pennies for, sold at auction for $250,000. So Warhol was this backdoor collector. Out of the watchful eye of the front door and free to write its own ticket, the back door plays by its own rules. Unburdened by official policy, it can quietly reshuffle the deck according to intuition, whim, and desire. While the front galleries sparkle with glamour and sexy commodities, the back door favors that which is economically worthless, but historically priceless. Trading in ephemera and ideas, the back door is unlocked and unguarded, for it's assumed that there's not much worth stealing inside that rear door, often a correct hunch. And yet, because the back door is always open, the ideas are infinitely democratic, transferable, and replicable, as well as free to all. At once playful, sometimes prankish, and at the same time deadly serious, the back door is perverse, embracing contradiction and impurity. It's also wildly utopian, proposing to make the impossible possible. What begins as a hunch or proposition over time becomes serious. If you do something wrong for long enough, it eventually becomes right, paradoxically transforming the back door into the new front door. Marcel Duchamp once made this door hinge between two frames that was always open and always shut. The door closed one entrance when it opened up the other, thereby contradicting the French proverb that a door must be either open or closed. It's both and neither at the same time. Writing to André Breton, Duchamp said, "For me, there is nothing other than yes, no, and indifferent. There is the example of the absence of investigations of this kind. Open and closed, pirate and legitimate, serious and playful. UbuWeb has modeled itself on Philippot's back door and Duchamp's pendulous door, resulting in a decades-long investigation into the absence of an investigation." UbuWeb's large, boundary-blurring archive of the avant-garde necessarily alters what is meant by the avant-garde, a term saddled with legacies of patriarchy, hegemony, imperialism, colonialization, and militarization. Giving voice to these concerns, the poet and artist Dick Higgins once wrote, quote, "The very concept of an avant-garde, which relates to the military metaphor of advanced troops coming before the main body, is masculine," unquote. The avant-garde theater scholar Kimberly Geronone concurs, saying, quote, "The term avant-garde, coming to us from the military and first applied to the arts around World War I, is heavily weighted by historical and political critical baggage. Indeed, the historical avant-garde often relied on sexist, racist, primitivist, and imperialist notions." And it's even true today. Witness how Italy's far-right party, Casa Pound, named itself after Ezra Pound, emblazoning images of him across their posters. Or of how one of Vladimir Putin's main ideologists, Vladislav Surkov, reputedly took techniques from his days as an avant-garde theater director and used them to sow confusion, discord, and chaos, exactly what the avant-garde excelled at into rightist political situations. When you assemble a collection of the avant-garde, you run the risk of replicating everything that is wrong and associated with it. To counteract this, I deployed impurity as a way of muddying, detouring, and playfully reimagining the avant-garde, twisting and warping the rigorous, hard-baked grids of modernism into something more fluid, organic, incorrect, and unpredictable. So just think of the many artists who dissembled received notions of the avant-garde as part and parcel of their avant-garde practices, such as Cornelius Cardew, Amiri Baraka, Musica Elettronica Viva, and Henry Flint, or others who took the idea of avant-garde in directions previously excluded from the canon. My mid-century avant-garde pantheon and inspiration comprises artists such as Moondog, Marie Menken, Harry Parch, Daphne Oram, Colin Nancarrow, Alice B. Toklas, and Sun Ra. Driven by outsiders and visionaries, my avant-garde revels in eccentricity, impurity, and innovative formal experimentation. And at the same time, I still love the denizens of the old canon, James Joyce, William Carlos Williams, and Pablo Picasso. But most of all, I love it when they all get jumbled up together on UbuWeb. Sparks fly when Henry Miller collides with Anna Mendieta, or Karl-Heinz Stockhausen with Hitosterol, Fatboy Slim with the Situationist International, Ouija with Carrie Mae Weems, F.T. Marinetti with Trin T. Minha, each nudging, reflecting, and shading their neighbors in unpredictable and destabilizing ways. That's me in 1989. With UbuWeb, the pronouns I and we are interchangeable because UbuWeb is mostly just me. Over the years, there have been editors and volunteers, but for the past 2 decades, I've pretty much been on my own, designing, coding, archiving, and assembling this site. I am completely unqualified for the job. I have a bachelor's in fine arts in sculpture that I got from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1984. I took one art history class in college, and it was on Baroque art. As a result, everything about UbuWeb is sort of skewed and idiosyncratic, if not entirely wrong. The taxonomies are vague, the collections are incomplete, and why certain things are there and others aren't is completely unclear. UbuWeb was assembled in the way that artists create their works, by following hunches, trusting intuitions, and blindly following them wherever they may lead, even when they lead to dead ends. This approach is both Ubu's blessing and its tragic flaw. It's what makes the site so exciting and dynamic, but makes it a flop for when it comes to rigorous academic research. While UbuWeb is a vast and diverse enterprise, it is still riddled with my subjectivity. Had someone else done UbuWeb, it would have undoubtedly been a more objective endeavor. The fact that I not only built and curated the site, but I also am writing its history speaks to an obvious bias, one that is replicated time and time again throughout the book that we're launching tonight, and also throughout the site as a whole. I have toiled for the past nearly 30 years, putting in, as Mike Kelly once said, quote, more love hours than can ever be repaid, building a utopia of avant-garde art, mixing the obscure and canonical, and making the mix purposely invisible to most people on the web. And we can talk about that. In the end, Ubu remains closest to the spirit of its namesake, an elaborate and sometimes obnoxious, exhaustive, and illogical endeavor, a pataphysical schoolboy prank illuminated and sanctioned by the bright green candle of Père Ubu himself. Shite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Wow. It's quite hard to move from this to somewhere else. This is overwhelming. I might have a short introduction about the amazing, not interest, but passion and love we had for the work you have done for the last decades, Kenny. When we started to build this publishing house, now JBE Books, Chamboite Éditions, then with Mathieu Senac, we really started to, we were so interested in what you've done with Ubu, and we started to do artists' books together, like Theory right here, this big ream of paper, like Against Translation. And in the history of the publishing house, like the 12 last years, something we have rarely or maybe never done, except with you, was to translate books into French, because that's not what we do, and that's not important here. But we felt the emergency, the need to do it. First, with your first book, and creative writing, that you published at Columbia University Press in 2011, that have been translated by François Bon under the title L'écriture sans écriture. And then again, right now, for the release of Patrimoine Pirate, directly translated from Duchamp is my lawyer. And I think this is our first question. But before, maybe let me open a parenthèse to welcome Jacopo Rasmi on stage also, and to explain also that Jacopo is a great also fan and knower of your work, and for this particular book wrote afterwards and notes that will enlighten the book for our French audience. So the book have been translated by Lionel Ruffel and Stéphane van der Egge, and have been augmented by Jacopo. So that's why it's so interesting that we have this conversation together. And now I close this parenthesis and go back to it. So Duchamp is my lawyer is the title you choose. And even during this first moment when we were hearing you, and in all your work, there are a lot of French and European artists that are raising from your work. Here, this is Duchamp. Can you just start to tell us about the title and this idea, this original idea of that book?
Yeah, so the title came from the late designer Virgil Abloh, oddly enough. And it was a quote that he did, I think in 32C on a conversation he had. And he said, whenever I get into trouble and people want to shut me down for copyright, I just simply look at them and I tell them Duchamp is my lawyer. And, Virgil Abloh just went on, to run the largest fashion houses in the world, but also maybe probably coming out of a shared culture space of hip hop, which of course is built upon samples and built upon shared culture and the reuse and the recycling of work, which I think Abloh did in Off-White and in those early gestures of his. So I just thought, God, I just got stuck on that, because that was sort of, in a way, UberWeb has been around for really now almost 30 years. And it was always my idea that, like, if I was ever sued, which I've never been sued, this is all illegal. Everything I've done on UberWeb is, there's nothing permissioned. I've broken the law for 30 years. I've never gotten into any trouble. And I always thought, yeah, it's just a Duchampian gesture. It's a recontextualization of an artifact into another space that creates a different type of meaning. So we have a thing in the States that's called fair use. And you can actually reuse pre-existing works of art. There's many levels to it, but the one that I want to focus on in terms of Duchamp is that in order for a work of art to be reused and be passed off as fair use, one of the tenets is that it has to have transformative value. It cannot be the same thing. It has to just have transformed something. And I thought, well, isn't that Duchamp? Wasn't it a contextual transformation, a moving from one place to another? In this case, a film on UberWeb is no longer a film. It's a digital artifact. And, I think that in the digital culture, we tend to not even think of the transference of different types of media. We just think, the film is on Netflix, and in no way is it a film. It's a completely different cultural artifact. And that was always sort of my justification for UberWeb, which again goes back to Duchamp. But I'm really interested to hear from both of you, like, why didn't you call this book Duchamp is My Lawyer?
That's where we go back to
Yes,
French.
please. Maybe we can have a small explanation in French, because
ahead,
I think it's going to be
I'll
like
talk to you.
tricky to try
Yeah,
to
you told
explain
me
this
about
French
it.
title in
Go ahead,
English,
do
right?
it in French.
But indeed, and that's also something that might be interesting to tell all of us during a Q&A session, because Duchamp is my lawyer is quite is a very poor title in French, like Duchamp est mon avocat. We didn't feel like it. Also because of the figure of Duchamp right now in our field. And maybe I will let Jacopo elaborate on our conversations. Yeah.
C'était un des premiers gros problèmes contre lesquels on a buté en commençant à travailler ensemble à plusieurs. Même juste pour le nommer entre nous, en fait, pour dire de quoi on parlait quand on s'écrivait des mails. Et, et comme on partait du point de vue que disait David, c'est-à-dire qu'on était un peu mal à l'aise par rapport à la lisibilité de ces titres, au moins vis-à-vis d'un public francophone, et qu'on avait envie de trouver un titre qui, sans être quelque chose de banal ou explicite, puisse renvoyer autrement au contenu de ce livre, qui est en réalité assez complexe, avec plein d'aventures, des péripéties intellectuelles. Mais finalement, on est tombé dans un espèce de brainstorming par mail. On évoquait plein de choses qui concernaient un peu le travail de Kenneth dans ce livre. On est tombé sur ce mot patrimoine. Je pense que j'avais écrit dans un mail et tu avais tout de suite rebondi en disant patrimoine, ok, mais il faut qu'on mette patrimoine pirate. Et on a lancé cette idée de l'appeler Patrimoine Pirate, avec cette contradiction. On était assez convaincus par la contradiction, qui est un peu les contradictions dont parlait Kenneth aussi, d'un site qui est à la fois légal et illégal, légitime et illégitime, avec des gens très connus, des gens inconnus, etc.
C'est vrai, il y a une dimension un peu intellectuelle du genre, ce que tu évoques à l'instant, et puis il y avait une dimension de sonorité aussi, de cette idée que Duchamp est mon avocat, la loi du chant, et toutes les pistes de titres comme ça ne fonctionnaient pas très bien. Et très rapidement, on arrive à un autre problème, qui est que lorsque on tombe sur cette notion de pirater un patrimoine, et on va y revenir avec Kenneth, parce que c'est aussi le travail qu'il décrit et à partir duquel il élabore une pensée dont on a vraiment besoin, je pense, aujourd'hui. On y viendra aussi dans la discussion, puisqu'il est question d'algorithmes, il est question d'IA, il est question de beaucoup de choses qui sont des choses du contemporain et qui sont ici prises un peu à leur source. En tout cas, quand on retombe sur ces notions et que le terme avec lequel on peut travailler, c'est patrimoine, ça a tout de suite évoqué d'autres questions que tu peux
Oui,
évoquer.
en fait, la deuxième étape dans cette réflexion a été, ok, patrimoine pirate, ça nous intéresse. Et après, en parlant avec des amis, on a dit, mais patrimoine, c'est un terme un peu problématique dans l'époque post-MeToo, etc., dans le monde de l'art, etc. Patrimoine, c'est l'héritage tel qu'il est établi par le père, par des autorités, et ça renvoie quelque part à un imaginaire patriarcal qui est celui que Kenneth, dès ses déclarations au début du livre, va essayer d'esquiver par rapport à l'avant-garde. Et donc, on s'est retrouvé avec un titre qu'on trouvait bien, mais qui était inutilisable parce qu'on partageait ces remarques. Et on était un peu coincé dans ce dilemme de qu'est-ce qu'on en fait de ces titres qui fonctionnent, mais qui...
Bon, et puis voilà, à propos du titre, la finalité de ça, c'est qu'il y a une astuce graphique qui consiste à barrer une partie des termes de notre titre, tout en l'assumant comme tel, et en rebondissant sur le fait que Duchamp is my lawyer est devenu Patrimoine Pirate, ce qui est aussi une façon d'essentialiser un petit peu le propos et de pouvoir se dire avec Kenneth, and then I will switch back in this strong French English, to get back to the book and to get back to the starting point of the book, which is UbiWeb, a website you founded in 1996. It's like a dinosaur of the web, still the same today. And I would really like to hear you, and I think we all really like to hear you, about this trajectory from 96 to now, what you have built, how it is still amazingly relevant, and at the same time competing with contemporary new ways of accessing art, culture, and all the resources that you raised up.
Yeah, no, it's funny. As I said, it's all illegal. I mean, obviously nobody cares about all this shit that's on Ubu. If it had any economic value, and sometimes I have put things on that had a little bit of economic value, and they come at me fast. I remember I put on Glenn Gould, but not the Goldberg concertos. I put on his very difficult avant-garde radio plays from the CBC from the 70s. They're just so beautiful, and they were really hard. They're extraordinarily hard to find. And the CBC just, anybody that put Glenn Gould on the web, regardless of what they were doing, made them take it down. And I wasn't going to tangle with the CBC's legal department, so I did what I normally do when I get a complaint from a corporation. I say, I'm very sorry. These were out of print. I try to say that UbuWeb is not a for-profit thing and we're not selling anything because no money is touched. By the way, this is the other thing. I mean, 30 years of running a website with zero money. I don't get paid. I don't pay anybody. I don't pay for server space. I don't pay for bandwidth, nothing. This has been run for 30 years without touching money, which is amazing. And then they come back and they say, well, we can't make an exception. We're a legal department. We took it down and we waited a few months and they went away. And then we put them back up and they've been there for 25 years. You know, I mean, they just want to intimidate you to take things down. And this is the other thing. It's like, I have a concept in this book that I call folk law, F-O-L-K. It's like folk art, right? Like it's not trained. It's like actually the way that law really works instead of the way that it's supposed to work. You know, I've kind of understood that unless something really has economic value, nobody's going to bother you about it. They can send threatening letters, but nobody is going to spend money suing somebody for a site that makes no money. It fucks up capitalism in the worst way. They're like, wait, we're going to sue you and you're not making any money? Like, this is just unthinkable to people. And it's been a very beautiful way of messing with those things. So I just want to say that, like, UbuWeb, the content on UbuWeb is the easiest thing in the world. Assembling a collection of cool avant-garde artifacts, that's easy. What's really difficult is all of these having to learn how to have been a folk lawyer. I mean, as I said, I have a degree in sculpture, but I'm a really good lawyer. And that's maybe the other reason why I want to do Shop. And this legal aspect is so much more about, UbuWeb is so much more about its legal aspects and the way it actually functions than it really is about the artwork. The artwork's good, but to me, there's other things that are much more interesting.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the fact that this book is not just about UbuWeb. It starts from UbuWeb and your own history, but it goes toward like a whole ecosystem of shadow libraries and other media. And you talk a lot about the thing David was saying. So how like cultural objects circulate and get to people. I
mean, you can't do this alone, right? I mean, it's weird. I mean, back in 1996, this was sort of what everyone was doing, right? And then we went through file sharing and MP3 blogs, and you know, and Pirate Bay. But of course, nobody does that anymore. I mean, I do still, but very few people. I mean, everybody. We've been convinced that the web is owned by Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk somehow. And, you know, nobody can go off, you know, you go to your Instagram and you go to your Facebook and you go to your Twitter and you go to your TikTok. And that has become the web, which was exactly what they wanted all the time. Now, the thing about UbuWeb is it's still possible to do what I did. You have to learn to write a little bit of HTML, which wasn't so hard, and get an FTP client and throw things up onto a server. It can happen still, but they've convinced us that it's impossible, that to make a website, you need millions of dollars and you need social media and you need, you know, I don't know, legal contracts and da-da-da. I mean, you don't need that. What I did in 1996 is still possible today. Nobody wants you to know that, right? I'm a bit of a dinosaur, I get it, but the thing is, it still fucking works. It works. And, you know, I write, if I put up a film yesterday, it's from the same HTML that I wrote in 1998. Nothing has changed, and it still works, and it still assures that people in places that don't have high bandwidth in parts of the world can actually access UberWeb. You don't need a powerful phone. You don't need a powerful browser. You know, this thing worked on a dial-up, and it still will work on a dial-up. It's not so hard, but we've been brainwashed completely. The web has just become privatized. And that's exactly what they wanted. You can't pirate anything on your iPhone. It's a closed ecosystem. Think about that. That's really horrible.
And that, I think that's one of the key things that the book addresses to us, is something that is like curation versus algorithm, to put it that way, in a way. Because when you started, there was not this strength of you look at something and then will suggest to you all the next thing that might interest you. So you had to choose and pick up and put and organize the things, which is very close to somehow curating things inside UberWeb.
UberWeb, I mean, I modeled it on like old school museums. Like, what's a museum, right? There are millions of artifacts out in the world, and somebody who sort of knows something about these things brings them all together under one roof, and that's your museum. You know, there's so many, the curatorial aspect is interesting because the web is just a jumble of artifacts. And UberWeb understood very early that the value was in the organization of those artifacts into some kind of coherent statement. This is just museology, you know, 101, a curation 101. But people seem to have forgotten that. You know, I was saying to myself, how come there are not 200 UberWebs, right? It never happened. And one of the reasons is, first of all, the main one is that people are afraid of copyright. My God, I can't do that. I'm going to get sued. Quite frankly, nobody's going to sue you for, you know, extreme avant-garde sound poetry. I have to tell you that, you know, it doesn't exist, actually. And in a lot of ways, and I say this in the book, copyright doesn't really exist for a certain set of cultural artifacts. To me, these are the most important artifacts, the ones I love the most. Do you know that most of the stuff on UberWeb, on the sound section, which is vast, is not on Spotify? Right? They may have one compilation somewhere of an Henri Chopin, right? Maybe one. But UberWeb has his entire discography and his entire oeuvre. So it's amazing, you know. I mean, there are, you know, so it still serves a function in spite of that. And then the algorithm part of this, well, the algorithm reifies your taste. It gives you more of what you already like. And the avant-garde was always about rupturing your taste. This is why somebody like John Cage introduced chance, so that you would run into unexpected things. Cage, you know, said if you listen to Beethoven every time, it's the same exact thing. But if you listen to the traffic on 6th Avenue closely, it's always different, right? And so the algorithm on UberWeb is alphabetization. And that's like when I did that little thing about Fatboy Slim and the Situationist International, et cetera, et cetera. What happens in alphabetization is it makes odd neighbors, people that you wouldn't think of, that just happen to go together. One of my favorite odd juxtapositions on UberWeb is the fact that Samuel, in the sound section, is that because of alphabetization, Samuel Beckett lives right next to Captain Beefheart, right? B-E-C and B-E-E. And it's so beautiful because you never would think, you know, Beefheart fans don't really like or talk about Beckett, and Beckett fans never talk about Captain Beefheart. But to me, that's, I mean, how can you have one without the other? You know, this is, I mean, they complement each other perfectly and beautifully. And those are the kind of random juxtapositions. So you have to remember that the web, like Zara's, you know, like Dada poetry, was built on randomization. As a matter of fact, there used to be, did you remember until a certain point, Google had a little button on the front page that said, "I'm feeling lucky." And you'd click on it and you'd go somewhere you didn't know. And just think of the CD player has a randomizing feature on it still. Like, what the fuck? Because the idea was that every time you could listen to a Beatles record, not in the way that you've always heard the Beatles record, but you hit the random function and you hear it different and new. So I think the DNA of the web was always surrealism, was always data, was, all of this randomization that, of course, today is completely gone because, God forbid, you're feeling lucky, you're going to go to some horrible site today where they're going to steal your data and they're going to surveil capital you to death, or you're going to see some horrible porn. I mean, who wants to do that? The web has become horrible and nobody wants to just, go web surfing. You don't want to go web surfing anymore. So, this is, it's scary. Like, the web really changed in these 30 years.
Yeah, but in a way, what the book also says to us is that you can still build these kind of trajectories. You are still able to build your own trajectories.
But nobody does. Netflix does. Netflix curate, they became like the UbuWeb. Like, somebody at Netflix said, "Hey, or Criterion Collection." Actually, they're better, right? On Criterion Collection, that really is an old-fashioned way of assembling things that have a cohesive vision, and I think that's a beautiful example of curation that actually does happen. It's not, listen, we're not the only ones, but they're not that many. And the other thing I also notice is there doesn't seem to be an interest in consolidation of artifacts anymore. Like, I think a younger generation is very comfortable with things just scattered out across Instagram, scattered out across TikTok, things that are impermanent, unstable. I mean, I was always interested in permanence and stability, which is why I've kept this thing running for 30 years. But I don't think people care. Like, if a link dies, I'm always upset when a link dies. I don't think anybody cares about dead links anymore, So it's something. A lot has changed. Oh my God, a lot has changed. I mean, it's like the difference between like TV in the 1950s and TV in the 1980s. That's the same time span as we're talking, right? That's 30 years, and how much television changed. I mean, this is typical of media.
I was thinking about when you were talking about the way you think about web to these and also the things that have been said by David. The idea of the library. You talk about a lot about libraries, public libraries that go to web, and you talk about how libraries can happen.
Yeah, so we were going to talk about shadow libraries, which I don't know how familiar you are with the concept of shadow libraries, but there are a lot of people like me out there that believe in the preservation and free distribution of cultural artifacts. And it's become an ecosystem of what's called shadow libraries. The most famous one would be something like Sci-Hub, right? The great repository of pirated scientific papers that everybody in the world can access for free, which has been sued to death by publishers and big pharma. But there are other ones. There's ARG, which maybe many of you know about, by Sean Dockery. There's Memory of the World by Marcel Mars. There's Monoscope by Dushan Barak. There's the Free Music Archive by WFMU. There's the Internet Archive, which has run into a lot of trouble recently with publishers, and that's sort of fucked. Because the Internet Archive is almost like too big. They're not shadowy, they're visible. And visibility is a problem. Visibility is such a problem that about 15 or so years ago, I actually removed UbuWeb from Google. And now you can't find it on Google. Because if you own a site, you can actually remove, you do that here in the European Union. to remove yourself from the web. This is something we actually don't really have much of in the States. So, you know, UberWeb went really underground, which is really where it should be. You're probably here because you've heard of UberWeb from someone else, or maybe in school, you know, you used it as a tool like 30 years ago when we were undergraduates or something like that. You know, and it travels word by word of mouth, the kind of way that, like, before MTV, you used to hear about a band, you know, in a zine, or a friend would say, hey, you've got to listen to this band. So, you know, I think that invisibility, you know, everybody wants to be at the white hot center of culture, like celebrity and even artists, my God, celebrity culture. I think the most beautiful things happen on the shadows, the shadow libraries, the margins. And the last thing I want to say, I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit, and we've got to have to wind up,
and then we'll open the
fairly
conversation.
soon. I don't want to bore everybody. But like, UberWeb is full of things that like never get watched. Never. There's like 5,000 films on UberWeb, and maybe 3 of them actually get viewed. But that does not matter. It matters that, because you would say the same thing about the library, the public library. Most of the books in the public library never get looked at, but they're there waiting for that one person that needs that book, and that book will change their life. Imagine if public libraries worked on popularity, there'd be a short shelf of books, right? And this is beautiful. That's what we want. This is called the preservation of cultural artifacts.
Thank you, Kenny. It's like, I think it's done. No, but this is so interesting. Like, this is an act of resistance, which it was not at the beginning, because
It was normal.
it was normal. That was the way you do,
Yeah.
not web browsers and stuff, only annuaire and, you know, ways to go in. Now there are mainstream algorithms and a strong resistance. I do feel there is a strong resistance. You named a few of the shadow libraries and Monoscope and so on, and UbiWeb. So they exist, and they are resisting to this. I don't know about resisting, but they're there.
It's
And-
no, it's not. It is a form of resistance. But here's the thing: like, both things exist at the same time. Facebook exists and UberWeb exists. They want you to think that only Facebook exists or the New York Times exists. But actually, all of these other things still exist simultaneously. UberWeb started like 5 years before Google, right? UberWeb was around before Google was, but Google coming on and happening, and same with Facebook, did not in any way affect Ubu. It's still there. They're there. We're here. That's the other thing you have to remember, you know. They'd love you to forget that, though, that the rest of the web still exists.
Let's keep our promises and maybe open the conversation to the audience with maybe question like.
I'd love to have your thoughts on artificial intelligence and like thinking about creative writing. Like, it seems like, is it the pinnacle or like the lowest point of on creative writing?
Well, I mean,
ChatGPT.
I've always thought that you know, we Christian Book many years ago prophesized that one day, since poetry lacks any real humanoid readership, that maybe we should just give it to the machines to write to each other, and thereby relieving ourselves of the burden of poetry. And I think that's actually happened now. So I think it's very happy. I think they let them write poetry. The thing is, though, one thing I learned, I was actually brought to Google to view the machine that writes poetry for Google and evaluate it for them. And they made the world's most advanced machine write like Tennyson or something, right? Like dead poets from centuries ago. And I was like, guys, like, why are you doing this? You know, and you know, with what you have, this is what you could produce. And the problem was, of course, they had to report back to their boss that the thing could actually write things that look like poetry. Like, of course, the something like Gertrude Stein, if you fed that into into the artificial intelligence engine as its food, it would break. It would be like, what the fuck is this? You know, it can't, which is exactly what the avant-garde always wanted to do, or Finnegan's Wake. But the thing was, the people that were feeding this information into the Google algorithm had no fucking idea what Finnegan's Wake was or who Gertrude Stein was. They're like, but this looks like poetry. I'm like, ah. So, I think it's okay. I really do think it's okay. But it just becomes a spectator sport now, which is sort of beautiful.
Bonsoir. I try to speak English, and I'm sorry for my awful and broken English, but I wanted to say, make a comment, a remark, and then a question. And my comment is about the title, Duchamp is my lover, and I think it's really a pity that you don't keep this title for 3 reasons. First reason, beyond the fact that it puts you in some way of anachronic matter, and also fiction matter, and also funny and subversive matter. There is another reason, and about an article 10 years ago in Le Monde, and there was a big polemic about this, and they were speaking about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence translated French to English. And they had an example, only one, and the one was, who is my lover? Because, and everybody, yes, I have the article at home, because if you say, who is my, or Peter is my lover, and you don't understand in French, if it's Pierre est mon avocat, I hate my lawyer. This was the sentence. Je déteste mon avocat, ou je déteste manger des avocats. Because lawyer means two, it's a synonym, and in French you say, or avocat is a fruit, and avocat is a lower.
Like avocado toast.
So your title is like something as a ready title, ready-made title, or ready-made linguistic, ready-made the title, and it's really funny, and this really great coincidence between this polemic in Le Monde.
That's beautiful.
10 years ago, so maybe it's the next publication. And the question is, what about you spoke about random, and I didn't understand exactly what you said about internet and. Le hasard.
Yeah, hasard. That's right. Hasard.
I didn't follow you exactly.
Well, I just think ultimately the web was built by post-hippie engineers who were on drugs, who were entirely influenced by surrealism. And I think the dream space, it was a dream space. And I think with that came all sorts of ideas of hazard and chance. And that was hard-baked into the internet. The internet was always a web, let's say, as opposed to a line. And that web then was nodal and created encounters that were not predictable, okay? And I think this has been one of the problems. We've tried to actually narrativize the web. And I think it's unnarrativizable. But I think they've done a great job convincing us that they actually understand that there's a real story to be told here. And, the web in its nature is disjunctive. And I just think that we work on these machines, and there are 16 windows open at any given time. And somehow we're not lost. We're moving from messages to Spotify, to the newspaper, to our word processing document, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the space, it's cubistic. Actually, formally, it's shattered. Things on top of things. It's fourth dimensional. And this is, again, like I really do feel that the incipient web was cubistic, it was surrealistic, it was futuristic. All of these sort of dead modernisms that we thought were sort of these planes that we saw modernism as a series of plane crashes right? The Cubist plane took off and then crashed because the Futurist plane rose, which crashed, which was taken over by the Surrealism plane, which crashed, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens if all these planes actually never crashed, but actually flew into the 21st century and were reborn as the web? And that's why I think the DNA of the web is modernist, ultimately. This is something nobody wants to talk about, really. But it's, to me, it's obvious that this is the world that we're living in is actually a kind of a advanced modernism idea. Thank you. Your English was great.
And I don't have much answer about the title. Sorry.
We'll reprint.
No, because that was one of our jokes. Duchamp is my avocado. But on another level, on a publisher level, I thought it was a poor title. That's it.
Hello, Kenneth. Thank you for coming to Paris again.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember me from Paris Aid a few years ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for coming.
I was wondering if you knew about Temple OS and what are your thoughts on this?
On what?
Temple OS. So if you don't know about it, I'm gonna
Maybe I'm not hearing it right, but tell me, what is it? Maybe no.
It's about like this guy who was like a computer engineer, and he had a kind of a religious illumination, and he thought that like he was on earth to like build like God's temple or something like that. And instead of going like building a real temple and cathedral, he built all his projects as an OS. And he built like this web cathedral where he was like, he created a whole world in a religious way. But like, I thought it was interesting about like what you were saying in contradiction to like modernism and all of these things. And because this guy was a clearly genius, like a code engineer genius, and he created all this OS, like an Apple OS, all these kind of things. But nobody ever knew about it. And just like you were saying about like UbiWeb, well, it's still there, but people don't know about it and everything. And he created this whole thing with games, web browsers and all of these kind of things, but nobody ever knew about it. And the guy went insane and he went homeless, even though he was a genius. And he even ended like killing himself. But then after his death, like all the web like knew about what he did, and then it became like really famous and a real like cultural thing. So I wanted like your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, nothing is unknown anymore. Nobody's unknown. Unfortunately, it often happens that a person must die before they're known. But there's an industry of finding strange people that did cool things and writing books about them and building shrines to them and things like that. But what it sort of sounds like to me when you were saying that, and I'm not familiar with the project, but it reminds me of Second Life. Remember Second Life, right? Which is still fucking going. That's actually, there was an article recently in the newspaper saying that that is still inhabited, which is, I mean, what is metaverse, right? It's nothing but Zuckerberg trying to really commercialize Second Life. But in Second Life, people were buying and selling real estate. But that's what they were doing in metaverse too. Can you imagine spending, $500,000 on a building in metaverse? What the fuck, right? So it's kind of like these kind of, again, I just think like visionary things are usurped. It's probably known by certain people, and they say, aha, Mark Zuckerberg, how can we capitalize on this? Very similar to the way that the Google engineers, had to write real poetry. So, I mean, there's always those visionaries that are out there, and they somehow get absorbed into commercial products, I think. Oculus, all of this now VR. Apple now has the new VR headset. We'll see where that goes.
And I was also wondering, like, I don't know if you've seen the second Blade Runner, but what do you think would happen if suddenly the cloud would disappear and all the things that we have stored on the web would disappear? Like, what do you think? Just like,
yeah. Oh, Well, I can just say one thing. Just so one small anecdote. My wife, Cheryl Donegan, is here. And she's a painter. And years ago, we stored some of Cheryl's paintings in my parents' basement, which was flooded. And we lost everything in the basement, my books, my papers, photographs, everything. Except when we went down to the basement, there were Cheryl's oil paintings floating on the top of the water. And she got them and she polished them off, cleaned them from the mud, and they were absolutely perfect. And this is why physical artifacts, like that, why is a painting so valuable? For that exact reason, So yeah, that was just the story I wanted to relate as a parable.
And maybe, Kenneth, we can also remind that you wrote in your book that it's important not to trust the cloud and download as much as possible.
Well, yeah,
what do you think about
yeah, that's true. Like things disappear from the web. You think it's going to be there forever, and it's not. You'll hit a URL, or this is not available in your country, or it's been blocked by China or something like that. Do you know that UberWeb? This is the craziest thing. UberWeb, which is full of the craziest, most far out politics, sexual perversion, I mean, you name it, is available in China and also in Russia still. And my feeling is that that the reason is because the censors hit this page and they go, oh no, this is a site for geriatric people. There's nothing harmful here. So yeah. So anyway, right, I think we should probably wind it up. But just to say that if you love something, download it. Honestly, make your own library, your own local library. Don't think that the cloud will be there forever. It won't. It's going to get shut down. It may disappear. And you should have your own personal library on hard drives, which are very, very cheap. And you really won't regret that. You will regret things on, like, for example, UberWeb could disappear tomorrow, right? And here's the last thing I'm going to say. We're doing this thing, which is amazing, with a beautiful pirate person called Marcel Mars. We're working on something called UberWeb in a cave, where you can have UberWeb on a hard drive and have the entire contents on it without an internet connection. It's a 2 terabyte download, and everything is relativized URLs, and all the media is there as well. And when you plug your hard drive back into the web, it'll pull down and update anything new that's there. So in a way, we're thinking there's a movement called UberWeb at 50, which isn't so far away, right? And the idea of this preservation. Marcel does something called memory of the world, and that's what we're interested in. We're interested in preserving the memory of the world, which can get knocked out any day by corrupt governments, by censors, by lawyers who are even worse than them, or people like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. So this is the resistance: is to keep backups of everything. Okay, I think we're done.
And if you care even more, you get the books.
Yeah, so yeah, please. Okay,
Merci beaucoup, Pascal Priest et le Jeu de Paume pour cet accueil. Merci, Kenneth. Et comme ce n'est pas fini, et pour bien profiter tous ensemble, nous avons cette petite règle fixée par Pascal qui est qu'on ne va pas discuter ici, on va tous monter boire un verre à la librairie et poursuivre la discussion là-haut, mais genre tout de suite. À tout de suite.